My background is in forestry, so I'm probably going to say a lot of things that are really basic to you guys who are experts in ranching and in soil, but I've spent a lot more time thinking about what goes on above ground in biomass than below ground. My name's Mick. I work at an organization called the Climate Trust in Portland, Oregon, and we are a carbon development and sort of protocol developer for a handful of different carbon sectors. Primarily we work in forestry. We also we do a lot of work in livestock digesters, taking methane from manure lagoons, burning it, and then getting the greenhouse gas benefit of converting methane to carbon dioxide. And recently we have gotten involved in grasslands. There's a new protocol beyond just the verified carbon standard that Jimmy was talking about that was developed about a year ago by an organization in California called the Climate Action Reserve. And let's see if I can figure this thing out seamlessly here. Nope.
It's on the side.
Popular graphic here of intact soil roots here. So there have been like 3 or 4 iterations of grassland protocols. Most of them have looked at sequestration rates, which you all know can vary substantially based on precipitation, based on soil fertility. My personal opinion, sort of unfounded, is that one of the reasons the Chicago Climate Exchange failed around this protocol is because there was so much variability. They rewrote the dang thing like 4 times in one summer, and it really undermined the market. The authors at the Climate Action Reserve got together with a handful of other experts from places like University of Colorado, University of Wyoming, folks who know carbon and soil, and wrote a new protocol based on all of that sort of knowledge, really looking at the avoided emissions, the emissions that would be created if you took intact rangeland and tilled it for commodity crop production. Basically, you're going to expose 10, 20, 30 years of sequestered carbon to oxygen, and it's going to oxidize. It's pretty simple. They work with the NRCS soil data that you guys can all access through Web Soil Survey, so it's a very standardized approach. This is not the best system. Well, go the other way. Yeah, so the whole intention is to create a pretty standardized, pretty uniform approach that's understandable and can be digested really wherever you are based on available data from the NRCS. One of the reasons this protocol has been created, and one of the reasons the Climate Trust has gotten really interested in it, is because of some of the pressure on agricultural lands, ranch lands, to convert these days. It's this really interesting relationship where there are both subsidies for biofuels and subsidies to not convert, and they're often working in opposition to each other. There was a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin, I believe, who used satellite imagery and did a study over the last almost 10 years now, looking at conversion rates across the country where intact grasslands were being converted to corn and soybeans and wheat, and it's pretty remarkable. The kind of takeaways here for me are, one, the level of expansion, but then also the pressure to grow corn and soy is really pushing wheat into more and more marginal lands that probably should be maintained for grazing, and I suspect some of you guys are feeling that here in Montana. So that pressure strangely has created some opportunity. One of the things that has happened is that the cropland reserve program, the sod saver provision, which applies to this region, has reduced the insurance premiums you would get for your crops if you convert on marginal land and they fail. Well, now you're only going to get 50% of the insurance for that now. And they're basically recognizing that this is a problem. We should stop converting grasslands, intact grasslands, and so we're going to stop the incentives for that. I think that ties in really well with these new carbon protocols, especially avoided emissions protocols, because you're now in a position to be paid for not converting rather than being penalized for not taking advantage of market forces. My role at the Climate Trust is to incur the brain damage of developing a project. Like Jimmy pointed out, you have to do the sampling, you have to understand the GIS, you have to figure out where all the data is coming from. And there are a handful of people out there who like to do that, and I think that I learned this in forestry, which is significantly more complicated. You have to measure every tree in your plots. They're fixed radius plots, they're permanent plots. So in some ways, grasslands are easier, and then the fact that it's publicly available data from the NRCS really makes it easy. There are certain criteria, though, that make a project eligible. The three kind of main tenets of carbon offsets are that they're real, you can measure them, you can demonstrate that they exist, that they're additional, which means that you're doing something beyond business as usual. You can't just get credit for sequestering carbon for kind of maintaining the same practices you would otherwise. You do things like improve your soil health. A lot of the things we've talked about today, because they sequester more carbon and may generally be looked at by markets as not sort of maximizing your bottom line, then they're real, they're additional, it's good actors. And then they have to be permanent. You have to agree to maintain that carbon in whatever ecosystems, in this case grasslands, for a certain amount of time. And so to demonstrate that, you have to be an eligible project. This is kind of a quick laundry list. One of the key criteria for an avoided conversion of grasslands project is that you enroll your land in a conservation easement that permanently protects or permanently prohibits your right to turn it into crops. I think it's important to recognize that that's a policy, and we're dealing with the policies of today that say we're never going to convert to a cropland. I'm sure if for some reason it became an issue where we needed biofuels for national security or something, those policies would be undone. When I think about natural resource management policy, I think it's important to recognize that it's changed. It always changes. No policy will be in place today and will be the same 100 years from now. They're dynamic to some extent. So don't let the permanence piece of this be too scary. I think, one of the other major criteria is that your grasslands have to have been intact long enough to sequester enough carbon to have a meaningful benefit. The protocol requires a minimum of 10 years. I have seen the best results for 30 years or longer. But for many of you, that's not an issue. That's really only, I have been seeing more of a problem when you're more in like Iowa and Missouri and places where commodity agriculture is a little bigger. A big component is proving that you're actually suitable for conversion to commodity crops. And so you have to have a certain suitability rating. It's determined by land capability class, which is NRCS ratings. You have to have 1, 2, 3, or 4 to be deemed reasonably eligible of converting. It's non-irrigated, although they're thinking about changing that part of the protocol. And then there has to be a financial incentive to convert. That's all figured out for you. You don't have to demonstrate any of that in your project. It's figured out by the reserve or by people like me. And I'm going to show you some maps of that in a second. And then the last big one is that you can't have a legal encumbrance on your property that would prevent you from converting already anyway. If you're already in an easement program, well, then you're not really demonstrating any additionality, so you're not going to convert, and you won't get credits under this protocol. So this is the map that has sort of determined eligibility by a county basis, and they basically are comparing the value of cropland to the value of rangeland, and if it meets a certain financial threshold, then it's deemed eligible. You have a financial incentive to convert your land to a different use. The major project inputs that go into this protocol, a quick feasibility assessment, right? You want to make sure that the cost of developing the projects are going to be worth the revenue you might get from the sale of your carbon offsets, that you're going to have enough carbon offsets to make it worthwhile. And then it really from there becomes an exercise in mapping and sort of gathering some pretty basic data that you probably already have anyway. Some of the higher level inputs that have been generated already are the major land use resource area you're in. MLRAs, sorry, I'm a forester, you guys probably know this, but it's your ecoregion, right? It's your soil type, it's your precipitation, it's basically a unifying ecological attributes of your area. Soil texture, which really means whether it's sand, loam, or clay, it's very simple. They have it all defined, how it would break down into each one of those based on, again, NRCS data. And then your land capability class. For grasslands protocols, it's an annual reporting period. Every 365 days, the cycle starts over again. And so some of the reporting period data that you would collect would be the number of animals and the number of days you're grazing those animals to back out some of the project level emissions that Jimmy talked about. The methane from the cows has to be accounted for in your project. You have to keep track of the fuel consumed during your project activities. And then if any area of your project burns, you have to track that. But because this is below ground carbon, it doesn't really impact your overall carbon stocks. It's just a very small deduction on that year. One of the things that I think is really exciting about this protocol and represents a major step forward for carbon offsets is that it allows landowners to aggregate together and form cooperatives. One of the major barriers has been the cost of doing these projects. If you don't have enough eligible acres or a large enough forested area or a big enough dairy, it just doesn't make sense to do it. But under this protocol, a handful of ranchers could get together and form a cooperative and reduce the transaction costs of developing a project, and therefore it's a lower per acre cost. I think that that's a very good thing, and I'm hoping that this sets the example for how it could work for other sectors as well. And I think one of the best things is that that cooperative doesn't have to be an official legal entity. It could be one rancher serving as the anchor ranch for the cooperative, taking on some of the responsibility for shepherding the larger group through the process. And then again, you have a common monitoring and reporting and verification period. Your projects can come and go. Once you establish the cooperative, if you want to be in it for 5 years and then exit, that's fine. There's a lot of flexibility around it, which is really good. And it really does allow you to achieve an economy of scale. This is about as technical as the development gets, right? You create a shapefile of your property. You can walk it with a GPS unit. You can send a PDF map to someone who knows GIS, and they can geo-reference it and create a shapefile. And then you plug it into Web Soil Survey, and you figure out your land capability, the number of acres in land capability class 1 through 4, and then you figure out your soil types. And then you give it to the Climate Action Reserve, and they calculate, based on some of the research they've done, they calculate the number of offsets that you generate. So it's really, really streamlining the process. This slide is from the Climate Action Reserve, and it describes the roles and responsibilities of developing a project. So you have a landowner who submits information about their property to the project developer, someone like me. I take that information and I submit it to the registry, which is the Climate Action Reserve, the author of the protocol. They review it, determine it to be an eligible project. We then take a bunch of information and submit it to a third-party verifier, which is an auditor, essentially. They approve it, let the registry know that they approved it. That approved project generates credits back, which go to the project developer. The project developer sells them. The buyer gives money to the project developer, who gives the money back to the landowner. And then you do it again, every year, for 50 years. There are more nuances to that, but you're allowed, under this protocol, you can generate revenue from the sale of credits for 50 years. Okay, that's the protocol. It's heavy stuff. We can talk about it later if you want. This is the bit about money that I'm sure people get more excited about. There's a great resource out there called Ecosystem Marketplace. They track the sale of carbon offsets on the voluntary market on an annual basis. And you can see that there was a slow and steady increase until about 2009 or so, and then a fairly steady plateau of voluntary carbon offsets on the market right now. Some of the abnormalities were created by the Chicago Climate Exchange, which isn't in existence anymore. And then there is also some of the forest projects that have driven down the prices that are international are developed under a standard called RED. It has some issues and a lot of political baggage, I would say. So conveniently, it's deforestation and it's not in the US. So we don't have to worry about it. The people who buy offsets, believe it or not, on the compliance side in the California market, we do have one regulated market here. They're large utility companies or manufacturers. If they produce more than 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide a year, then the state requires them to offset their greenhouse gas footprint. On the voluntary side, you have folks like Chevy and Disney and Energy and Microsoft, whose shareholders have said, we want you to be a socially responsible company, go out and mitigate your climate impact. To date, there has been one sale of carbon offsets from a grasslands project. It was up in the Dakotas. Ducks Unlimited developed it with some help from us. Chevy bought those credits. I don't know for certain what the price was, but I've been told the range is between $6 and $8 a ton. So not insubstantial. Two important points, I think. The California market is expanding. The number of offsets available is significantly below the demand. And so they're looking for new protocols to bring into the compliance market. I am reasonably optimistic that this grasslands protocol will be one of the next ones brought in. Right now there's just forestry, mine methane capture, rice cultivation, and then destruction of ozone depleting substances. So there will be more, and I do think grassland stands a good chance of being the next one. If that happens, then the market certainty and price certainty around grasslands offsets it gets a lot stronger. And this really does represent an incredible opportunity for folks who want to ranch and maintain ranching land. It could be really good. This is sort of the historical price of voluntary offsets. Again, you can see what the Chicago Climate Exchange did to the price there when it tanked in 2009. But generally, the range is between $4 and $8. I think that there is some sort of, there's often a correlation between the newness of a protocol and the price that people will pay. I, again, am optimistic that this grasslands protocol will demand a higher price, at least initially. The agricultural sector is much bigger. I think companies like Caterpillar or Cargill or some of the huge corporations that are starting to realize that climate change is going to really impact their bottom line are gonna be interested in this protocol. And part of our job at the Climate Trust and our partners is to get them interested in it and get them to buy these offsets. So internally, we think the value of an offset under this protocol is more like $6 to $8. So for whatever that's worth. That was pretty fast, and I did that because I have the unenviable position of being right before lunch. But we both just gave you guys a lot of information about carbon offsets and carbon markets. And so, is there 5 or 10 minutes for questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had a slide up there with web soil survey.
Yeah.
And I'd be really interested in how many people have ever been on web soil survey or its competitor, Soil Web. Could we just see a show of hands? Web soil survey. And how about Soil Web? Okay, thanks. Just, I think that might be a much more user-friendly interface as you work up this protocol. Are you familiar with Soil Web?
I am not. The protocol does want you to use web soil survey. I would think my experience with other protocols is if the software is open, then it doesn't matter. But the registries have been careful not to make you pay for a forest growth and yield model or access for something like that. Yeah.
Should be on.
In order to be applicable, does the land that you're working with have to be, you have to prove that it could be cropland, but you're saving it as grassland, it has to work like that?
Yes, and that's the land capability classification. So it has to be suitable for crops. You couldn't take really poor rocky soil and say, oh, I'm going to grow corn here. Like that wouldn't happen. And then you have to demonstrate that in your county, the value of cropland is sufficiently higher than the value of rangeland that you would have a financial incentive to convert. But conveniently, the NRCS has figured out your land capability classification, and the Climate Action Reserve has done that financial analysis. So it's a very quick process to figure out if you're eligible.
Okay, do you see in the future that, I guess I from my perspective, I feel like that's like such a limited approach on like why you should be conserving grassland. Do you see that in the future that there would be other reasons for conserving grassland would be considered part of a protocol that would, you know, make you eligible for getting carbon credits?
It's a good question. I completely agree. Offsets are, in my mind, mostly a vehicle for encouraging people to manage their land responsibly, whether it's forestry or grasslands. I support that strongly. I do think that there are other programs that maybe are more applicable to more marginal land when it comes to classification, like sage grouse or lesser prairie chicken type payments. I do think one of the really important things around carbon offsets is that they're scientifically defensible, because there are a lot of people who don't believe that offsets are good. They believe that they're just a mechanism to allow corporations to continue to pollute, and that particularly inner city communities or communities around refineries or manufacturing suffer as a result. So in order to prevent that, well, there's two parts. One, the linkage between sort of producers or upstream folks and then downstream consumers needs to be defined better or made more clear. And then two, I think being able to show that offsets really have they're defensible and that it is a global thing is important. And so while there is carbon on marginal lands, it does potentially undermine the program or the concept of an offset, in my opinion. Yes? Oh,
One of the bigger issues than conversion to cropland is actually conversion to development, housing development. So that's not taken into consideration in the protocols?
And there is an avoided conversion to housing development in forestry protocol. The challenge, as I would see it with grasslands, is that you're generally looking at emission reduction rates of around 1 to 2 tons an acre a year. And that's different than sequestration, I know, and that's a whole, where I don't know where Blaine went, but that's a whole other equation. Developments are occurring in 50, 100, 150 acre chunks, not 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 acre chunks at a time. And so, while you could use that as a pressure, I'm not sure the economics would work.
Hi, Pamela Chang from Belgrade. So I'm curious if the protocol allows for conversion of cropland to pasture, because that's actually what we've done for the last 30 years at our location, and we're seeing incredible health.
Not this one, but this isn't the end. I mean, these things are being written pretty frequently, and there are 3 leading registries. There's the Climate Action Reserve, there's the Verified Carbon Standard, and then there's the American Carbon Registry. And there are constantly people coming up with new protocols. And I know that there are people working on composting and biochar and things like that too. Right now, I think the biochar one is in peer review at the moment. So there are protocols coming for activities like that. Maybe you might know, you might be able to better for that one.
Yeah, I think that basically it's about measuring carbon sequestration in the soil. Once we get the protocol for that right, then everything's going to make sense. But that's just a more complex thing, and that's why we're doing the easier thing.